When it comes to 20th century history, there are few names as well known as that of Adolf Hitler, Germany's leader building up to and during World War II. However, unlike so many of history's heroes, Adolf Hitler has gone down in the record books for all the wrong reasons. The atrocities committed in his name resulted in the deaths of millions of innocent people, and images of emaciated figures struggling for survival in the concentration camps are synonymous with the reign of terror that Hitler dictated, leaving mankind struggling to make sense of how such a situation could have arisen. Understanding the past can, without doubt, bring hope for the future, and in the case of Adolf Hitler, the benefit of hindsight is a very valuable thing. Tracking his path from insignificance to world domination through to ignominious death in a Berlin bunker demonstrates how the delusions of one man can do irreparable damage if not kept in check, and confirms the old adage that absolute power corrupts absolutely. The classic image of Adolf Hitler, with slicked down black hair and square moustache, surrounded by swastikas and stormtroopers, is one that we're all familiar with. But as with every complex figure from history, to discover the real man behind the legend, we do need to go right back to the beginning. If that old adage that says, "Give me a child until he is 7 and I will show you the man," has any substance, it is certainly relevant for anyone considering the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler. It does come as a surprise to many people that Adolf Hitler was born an Austrian rather than a German, to parents living in the otherwise unexceptional little town of Braunau am Inn, and it was at 6:30 p.m. on the 20th of April 1889 that Adolf Hitler made his first appearance in the history books. Needless to say, the event is not celebrated here, and all you'll find as a reminder of Hitler's birth is a simple granite stone taken from the Mauthausen concentration camp, bearing a stark message, which roughly translates as, "For peace, freedom and democracy, never again fascism, remember the millions of dead." On the surface, the Hitler family were fairly typical of the late 19th century era. Clara, Adolf's mother, was Alois Hitler's third wife, and there were already 2 children from his second marriage, Alois Jr. and Angela. And although Clara went on to give birth to 6 of Alois' children, only Adolf and his sister Paula survived to adulthood. However, right from the start, this had been a contentious union, as Clara was so closely related to Alois, a papal dispensation had to be obtained before they could marry. As an official in the Imperial Customs Service, Alois was well paid, but away from home a great deal of the time. And when he returned, his violence towards his son meant young Adolf had a far from ideal upbringing. His own words in later life are very telling indeed. "I never loved my father. I therefore feared him all the more. He had a terrible temper and often whipped me." The reasons for these beatings are largely unknown, but one theory is that Alois was determined to have his son follow in his footsteps and become a civil servant, while Adolf was set on a career as an artist. As is often the case with a violent disciplinarian father, Adolf sought refuge in the love of his mother, who he undoubtedly adored. Clara, in turn, poured all her affection into pampering her son, and in her eyes Adolf could do no wrong. When it came to education, looking at Hitler's frenzied concentration-making speeches, it's hard to believe that at school he was regarded as a lazy pupil. But when it came to reading about war, which he also loved to act out, he apparently became a great deal more animated. Interestingly, he always chose to play the underdog, and even from this young age, it's possible to see evidence of a trait that would see him determined to rebuild the German Empire from a position of extreme weakness after the First World War. By the time Adolf was 14, his father had died of a lung hemorrhage, and although Adolf was free from his father's abusive hand, with only his doting mother for guidance, Hitler lost any sense of discipline which he badly needed. As a result, Adolf was expelled from school and eventually persuaded Clara to let him opt out altogether at the age of 16 with no qualifications whatsoever. 2 years after the death of Alois, Adolf set off for Austria's capital Vienna in search of fame and fortune as an artist. When he was rejected twice by the Academy of Fine Arts, he attempted to make his living painting pictures from postcards to sell to tourists. But when his mother died of breast cancer days before Christmas 1907, Adolf Hitler was inconsolable. The devoted son hardly left Clara's side during her last weeks, and the family doctor said that he'd never before seen anyone struck with grief to the degree that young Adolf Hitler was. After his mother's funeral, he returned to Vienna, but found little to cheer him up. And although advised by the Academy of Fine Arts when he was rejected that his skills were more suited to architecture, he'd left school without the formal qualifications needed to be accepted for training. Even so, architecture would become an obsession for Hitler as Germany's Führer, and his architect, Albert Speer, was tried for war crimes at Nuremberg along with other prominent Nazis like Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess. Seeing images of Hitler at the height of his powers, without doubt he lived in comfort and luxury, his every whim catered for. But in the years after his mother's death, struggling to make his way in the world, it was a very different story. In fact, after becoming increasingly depressed with his failings instead of trying harder, in November 1908 he despondently took to the streets in a state of depression and anxiety. Hitler had lost it all. His mother, his dream of becoming an artist, was homeless and ended up spending 3 months on the streets, contemplating the future and wondering what to do with his life. But gradually, Hitler began to claw his way back into society, firstly seeking refuge in a shelter for the homeless, before settling into lodgings for poor working men. Some suggest that Hitler was a confirmed anti-Semite before he moved to Vienna. However, without doubt, the city was a hotbed of traditional religious prejudice, and he certainly came into contact with others who believed the Jews were responsible for the misfortunes of Austria. Whatever the origins of Hitler's notions of racial purity, an opportunity arose for him to leave Austria in 1913, when he inherited the last part of his father's estate, and he moved to Munich, saying that he'd always wanted to live in a real German city. The relocation also helped him avoid conscription into the Austrian army, something that he very clearly did not want to happen. Hitler was always adamant that he avoided conscription because he didn't want to join the Austrian army rather than due to cowardice. He'd always felt a connection with Germany, and when World War I broke out in 1914, he was overjoyed and later wrote, I am not ashamed to say, carried away by enthusiasm of the moment, I sank down on my knees and thanked heaven out of the fullness of my heart for granting me the good fortune of being permitted to live in such a time. With Hitler's love of warfare and his newly adopted homeland, Germany, he immediately volunteered to fight for the German army. This was a crucial turning point in Hitler's life and that of history. Up until this moment in time, fate could have taken the future dictator's fortunes in any direction. He could have continued painting, gone on to become a civil servant, or just disappeared into obscurity. But as a fervent young patriot going off to war, Hitler was destined to embark upon a path that would lead him and the world to the brink of disaster. As a volunteer, Hitler was certainly dedicated, earning various medals, never asking for leave, and living the life of a model soldier. Reports state, however, that people around him became annoyed by his eccentric behaviour and his unquestioning, unflinching patriotism towards the German cause. However, this most memorable period in his life, as he described it, soon ended when news of Germany's defeat reached him as he lay in hospital after becoming temporarily blinded by a mustard gas attack in 1918. Many years later, he recalled the moment in vivid detail. Everything went black again before my eyes. I tottered and groped my way back to the ward, threw myself on my bunk and dug my burning head into my blanket and pillow. So it had all been in vain. It was yet one more disappointment for Hitler, and despite lacking a formal education, he vowed to rectify the situation and restore German national pride, no matter what the consequences. With the signing of the Treaty of Versailles on 28th of June 1919, Germany was forced to take full responsibility for the war, and with the flourish of a pen, the German Empire was destroyed. Hitler and a number of his compatriots couldn't believe what was happening, and he claimed that his adopted people were being stabbed in the back by socialists, Jews, and democratic politicians. It was time for Hitler, the political animal, to take over from the soldier. When he returned from the trenches to Munich, it was evident that Germany had lost its sense of direction. There were numerous political parties clambering to take control, and as a result, there were riots, assignations, and ever-changing shifts of power. Germany hadn't only been defeated in the war, the nation had also been so severely punished it was impossible for economic stability to be restored. Hitler found himself ideally placed to convince others that his radical views were perfectly acceptable, as Germany had been treated so badly by the rest of the world. Firstly, Hitler gave his support to factions of the army that wanted to overthrow the new republic, and in a very short time his determination was rewarded. The budding leader was handpicked to become a political instructor and was sent to learn about anti-Bolshevism, which is when his talent as a public speaker came to light. The political wing of the army could see Adolf Hitler's strengths as an orator, which would prove extremely useful for propaganda purposes, and he was sent to observe a small German Workers' Party with extreme nationalist views. On the 12th of September 1919, Adolf Hitler spoke at a meeting of the German Workers' Party. It went down so well that he was immediately asked to join the committee, and within a few months he'd taken over the leadership. The group is thought to have had only about 40 members at the time, but it was just the platform Hitler needed to launch himself from. In 1920, the name was changed from the German Workers' Party to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, in effect, the birth of Nazism. Next, Hitler designed the iconic swastika symbol, giving the party an unmistakable image, then turned his attention to a weekly newspaper to help spread his propaganda around Munich. After a short while, the Nazis had recruited thousands of ex-soldiers to form their own private army, the SA, and support for the party and its leader escalated at a remarkable pace. Alongside the German nationalistic cause, Hitler was also able to present his anti-Semitic and other equally extreme views to the growing Socialist Party. So it was that Adolf Hitler became a very popular leader, accepted as being the saviour of the German people, without anyone realising the dangers his distorted opinions could pose. It was almost an overnight success, and the newfound power quickly went to Adolf Hitler's head. He demanded a no-questions-asked policy, and anyone who didn't agree with Hitler was swiftly and, on occasion, violently expelled. Then, on the 8th of November 1923, along with 600 members of the SA, he burst into the Munich beer hall, where the leader of the Bavarian government was addressing a large crowd. Hitler jumped upon a table and, shooting his revolver into the air, shouted, "The National Revolution has begun." But Hitler had banked on the army, police and the rest of the government supporting the coup. Only when it came to the crunch moment, they failed him. Undeterred by his embarrassment, Hitler was still confident that he could steal power in Munich. So the next day, he tried much the same thing again, only this time he was arrested. For many leaders, this would have been the end of their career. However, Hitler had a great deal of support in Munich, and consequently was only given a minimal sentence of 5 years in prison and served just 13 months. What's more, Hitler was completely unrepentant and used his time in prison to mastermind his grand plan. He dictated to his deputy Rudolf Hess the book Mein Kampf, which translates as My Struggle, and he hoped this book would be a Bible for his followers. He laid down his plans, his vision, and cemented his view of the master race. From his prison cell, Hitler also decided that his political party must be completely transformed and expanded nationally, because the Nazis needed to spread throughout Germany to contest the existing political system and take complete control. It wasn't long before the Nazis had become a seemingly legitimate political party, and when the Wall Street crash hit America and the Great Depression spread far and wide during the early 1930s, the Nazi ideology seemed very attractive indeed to the poverty-stricken German masses. Within 10 years, the Nazi Party had increased the number of seats they held in the Reichstag from 14 to 288, and on the 30th of January 1933, Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor, ready to put the next phase of his plan into action. Although an election was scheduled for early March, it would be fair to say that democracy had already broken down. Communist meetings were banned, the Catholic Centre Party had their meetings disrupted, and the election rallies of the Social Democrats were often violently broken up. seem that you either supported the Nazis by choice or force, and a climate of terror already reigned. The Reichstag today looks as if nothing could ever have troubled its dignified exterior. But on the night of 27th of February 1933, a ferocious blaze ripped through the building, destroying the Great Hall and leaving the German seat of government in ruins. The Nazi Party used this disastrous event to their advantage, blaming the communists for starting the fire, justifying their introduction of a state of virtual martial law and, in effect, a total ban on the communists. Any threat to Hitler in the elections had been neutralised, and it's been suggested since that it was the Nazis who started the Reichstag fire in order to discredit their opponents. Not surprisingly, the Nazis, with Adolf Hitler at the helm, stormed to power. And to ensure there was no chance of democracy making a comeback, other political parties were dissolved, the press was taken over, and a Nazi occupied every seat in the rebuilt Reichstag. The final blow to democracy came with the death of President Hindenburg on the 2nd of August 1934, when a law was passed proclaiming the presidency dormant, transferring the role and its powers to Hitler as head of state. He became Führer and Reichskanzler and supreme commander of the military machine he was building, in direct contravention of the Treaty of Versailles. Officers were forced to swear an oath of allegiance not to the Constitution, but to Hitler personally, and from this moment onwards it was impossible for anyone to legally challenge anything Hitler chose to do. In just 20 years, Adolf Hitler had gone from a volunteer soldier to the Führer of a right-wing dictatorship. But this was only the beginning, and it wasn't long before the extremes Hitler was prepared to go to put Germany back on the map began to surface. In his opinion, the German peoples needed Lebensraum, which translates into living space, and it was his aim to create enough living space for an explosion in the nation's population. Of course, to do this, he'd have to take land that belonged to other countries, and Hitler's first step towards his goal came on the 7th of March 1936, when he sent his troops into the Rhineland, placing a military presence in territory that had once belonged to the old German Empire before being taken away by the Treaty of Versailles. With the benefit of hindsight, it's obvious that Hitler's blatant breaking of the treaty should have been dealt with at the outset, but nothing was done. Also, because he was giving the German people a new sense of pride, by the end of 1936, Hitler's popularity had reached new highs. The military was expanding, pacts had been agreed with Italy, and it looked as though there'd be no stopping Hitler's rise to power as he turned his attention to global domination. Since becoming a notable political figure in 1933, Hitler had concentrated on foreign policy, and in particular the Treaty of Versailles, or as he renamed it, the Slave Treaty, which he was obsessed with destroying. But it wasn't only foreign policy that was the order of the day for Hitler. He was also changing German society, and this is when his deeply entrenched personal prejudices started to come to the fore. Family planning clinics were closed, so more babies would be born. He gave newlyweds a copy of Mein Kampf to take on honeymoon, and entertainments were purged of anything the Nazis didn't approve of. Jews and other minority groups were victimised as Hitler moved towards his goal of a pure Aryan race, and education was streamlined so that the young were indoctrinated with Nazi ideas. And in May 1938, Hitler even commissioned the design of the perfect family car for his master race to drive. The car in question we know today as the Volkswagen Beetle, and from these early beginnings in Nazi Germany, the people's car went on to become one of the world's most iconic vehicles. Although, in the 21st century, very few people realise that it was Adolf Hitler who was responsible for its creation. Now, in Hitler's favour, the VW Beetle was a creditable contribution to world history. But the same could never be said of what was to follow, because Hitler was preparing for war. The new targets were Austria and Czechoslovakia, and at last Europe, particularly Great Britain and France, sensed that Hitler was becoming a problem. On the 12th of March 1938, after much bullying of the Austrian government, German troops occupied Austria without firing a single shot and swiftly turned their guns towards Czechoslovakia, but still no action was taken to stop Hitler in his tracks. Up until this point, Hitler's rise to power had gone unchallenged, but there were warning bells ringing in Britain, with Winston Churchill adding his voice to concerns. Nevertheless, Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain favoured a peaceful settlement and flew to meet Hitler to negotiate a diplomatic agreement. The German Führer very plainly told Chamberlain that he wanted the Sudetenland incorporated into Germany, or there would be war. And as the British Prime Minister was so keen to appease, he actually persuaded the French and the Czechs to agree to Hitler's demands. Chamberlain flew back to London, clutching the signed Munich Agreement. He proudly declared that it would mean peace for our time, while the Sudetenland was handed to Hitler on a plate. Now, Hitler had even more power, and as Churchill had predicted, his promise of peace was nothing but a hollow sham. On March the 15th, 1939, the Nazis stormed into Czechoslovakia to take up occupation. The Czech troops were no match for Hitler's military machine and simply laid down their weapons as the Germans roared in. Soon after that, Lithuania also fell, and by now the world knew that Hitler could no longer be appeased, and the time for direct action had now come. War in Europe was imminent, but Hitler was at the height of his manipulative powers, and in August 1939 he signed a non-aggression pact with the Russians to guarantee he'd not be attacked from the east. Unbeknown to the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, Hitler's contempt for the Russians was almost as fierce as his hatred of the Jews, but at this point he was well aware that he did not have the manpower to take on the British, the French, and the Soviets. He said, "I shall stretch out my hand to Stalin at the common frontier, and with him undertake to redistribute the world. After Stalin's death, he is a very sick man, we will break the Soviet Union. Then will begin the dawn of the German rule on earth." Chilling words, but for the time being at least, Hitler was safe from an attack on the Eastern Front and in a position to march on Poland. This was key because Britain and France had signed a pact with Poland to support them in the event of a German invasion, and even Chamberlain had no way of using appeasement to stop Hitler in his tracks this time. On the 3rd of September 1939, at 11:15 a.m, a seemingly peaceful Sunday morning in Britain, one of the most fateful dates in world history was etched on the memories of millions of people. The lawnmowers stopped, and families crowded around their wireless sets to hear Prime Minister Chamberlain deliver one of the gravest messages in modern history.
I am speaking to you in the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note, stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
However, Hitler had bought himself a great deal of time and was well prepared, and the mighty Nazi war machine looked unstoppable. Soon after the occupation of Poland, Denmark and Norway also fell, and as Hitler stormed through mainland Europe, his powerful panzer tank divisions ripped through the countryside. Although enjoying the protection of the English Channel, the people of Britain were well aware that Hitler would soon look towards their island, and Chamberlain no longer inspired confidence for a nation at war. On the 10th of May 1940, Winston Churchill was invited to form a wartime coalition government, and as Prime Minister, he would lead the British into battle. Hitler now had a worthy adversary, but his star was still in the ascendancy, and it seemed the self-appointed Führer could, from a strategic point of view, do no wrong. With Hitler's troops deep in Holland, moving ever more menacingly towards France, the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, sent by Churchill in support of the French, suddenly found themselves in grave danger. The German troops had unexpectedly made a thrust through the Ardennes, splitting the Allied forces in two and engulfing them on both sides. The French troops and the BEF were trapped in northern France and were pushed back to the beaches of Dunkirk. With the Nazis closing in on them from all sides, it looked as though, in a matter of days, Hitler's forces would wipe them out. But as the Allies fell back to the beaches to await their fate, the German tanks stopped short of Dunkirk. Had Hitler lost his nerve? It was hardly likely, as more than 300,000 men escaped the clutches of the Nazis to fight another day between the 27th of May and the 4th of June 1940. History has been left with a fascinating yet probably unanswerable question. Some believe that Hitler let the troops go as a peace offering to the British, because he still hoped for an Anglo-German pact. Others think it was because he was more interested in getting to Paris and securing the occupation of France that made him momentarily lose his focus. It has also been suggested that Hitler had promised the Luftwaffe that they should have the honour of finishing off the BEF as sitting ducks on the Dunkirk beaches. Whatever the truth, it was a key error of judgment, and although still a victory for the Nazis, it was the point at which Hitler's fortunes started to turn. As well as the strategic considerations, it is possible Hitler's undoubted arrogance played a part in allowing more than 250,000 fighting men to slip through his fingers. Hitler said of the event, "It's always good to let a broken army return home to show the civilian population what a beating they had." This was evidently a man confident of victory and underestimating the enemy. What he failed to appreciate was that by letting a broken army run home, you allow them to fight another day. And a few years later, when the Allies returned to France, Hitler was close to being defeated, and the D-Day landings of June 1944 marked the final point where the Germans could actually have turned the war back in their favour. But as the BEF were rescued from Dunkirk in 1940, the D-Day landings were a long way off, and following Hitler's actions step by step will reveal how, from a position of such strength, even the mightiest can fall. With most of Europe now under his control, Hitler did look towards Britain when he realised, with Winston Churchill as Prime Minister, there was never going to be an Anglo-German pact. Hitler had always said that the British and German people belonged together racially and traditionally. However, Churchill saw things very differently. So Hitler issued a directive on the 16th of July 1940 to begin the invasion of the British Isles, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, a campaign he believed would be concluded before the winter set in. As the British summer reached its peak, the Air Force took to the air, while the Navy watched the seas as the Battle of Britain got underway. Hitler knew that the only way to conquer Britain would be to get his speeding panzer divisions onto dry land. But before this could happen, both the RAF and the Royal Navy would have to be destroyed, and in that order. After weeks of dogfights and bomb attacks on RAF bases, Hitler came closer than he knew to achieving his objective. But a strange succession of events distracted him at the precise moment he could have secured victory. The Luftwaffe concentrated predominantly on bombing the airfields of southeastern Britain. However, during one raid, there was an incident when a German bomber found himself way off course. An RAF fighter had pursued him, and while in the skies over London, the Luftwaffe pilot dropped his cargo of bombs. Acting quickly, Churchill, assuming that Hitler had changed his strategy to target the British capital, retaliated by sending the RAF to bomb German cities. Hitler was incensed and really did begin an attack on London that became known as the Blitz, as well as other major British cities, including Plymouth, Coventry, Manchester, Sheffield and Southampton. Now, although this was bad news for Britain's city dwellers, it did give the RAF the breathing space they needed to get back into the fight. And with the Luftwaffe having to fly further inland to hit their targets, they were a great deal more vulnerable. Without viewing the bigger picture properly, Hitler had made another snap judgment that would cost him dearly. With the summer over, on the 17th of September 1940, Hitler had to postpone Operation Sea Lion because the tides would not be suitable for an invasion by sea until spring 1941. Unused to having his plans thwarted, Hitler threw everything he had into the Blitz, determined to break the spirit of the British people. But again, he underestimated his enemy, and more importantly, the rare skill of Winston Churchill to motivate the people. The cracks in Hitler's abilities as a military tactician and fatal flaws in his personality were beginning to show. Even by this early stage, he would not tolerate criticism from any of his advisors, convinced that he was invincible, and just like the Roman emperors who he hoped to emulate, Hitler's megalomania was destined to destroy him. After the disappointment of Operation Sea Lion, Hitler turned his gaze to the Soviet Union, no doubt looking for a quick, decisive victory to keep his demons at bay. Hitler rushed headlong into his plans to invade Russia, reneging on his non-aggression pact with Stalin, without fully appreciating how difficult it would be to open up the war on two fronts, especially when already resources were spread very thin. It was becoming obvious that this war was one man's personal crusade, and his decision to send 3 million troops into the Soviet Union, with the benefit of hindsight, can only be described as a huge error of judgment. No one, least of all Hitler, had any idea what the Soviet military was capable of, and Churchill famously described the Russians as a mystery wrapped up in an enigma. Unbeknown to the outside world, Stalin had totally transformed his military forces. And when the German army charged across the border on the 22nd of June 1941, they were in for the shock of their lives. The fighting in Russia tied up a huge number of Hitler's men for the rest of the war, and as his rationality became steadily more questionable, the odds were rapidly stacking against him. As 1941 progressed, another headache developed for Hitler as a result of his alliance with the Japanese. When they attacked the US Navy stationed at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, not only did Hitler have the British and the Russians as enemies, but he now had the full might of the American military directed against him as well. True, he was still on the offensive and controlled most of Europe, and during 1942, his persecution of the Jews and other minority groups reached alarming new heights. The atrocities being committed in the concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Belsen, became daily more inhuman. And when news reached the Allies of the scale of the horrors, the genocide ordered by Hitler resulted in a heightened determination to defeat him. That Hitler's absolute power had by this time corrupted him absolutely was beyond question. And during 1943, his erratic behaviour and bizarre judgment even set alarm bells ringing amongst his own. His left hand had also started to shake uncontrollably, which many historians have since speculated was due to the onset of Parkinson's disease, but this has never been proved. The tide had turned dramatically against Hitler, and although, like a wounded animal, he was still capable of doing an incredible amount of damage, By early 1943, his fate was sealed in Russia, and his fall from power became simply a matter of time. The Battle of Stalingrad developed into arguably the bloodiest battle in human history. In the depths of the Russian winter, the German Sixth Army was completely destroyed, and Hitler could do nothing as he became vulnerable to attack from the Russians on the Eastern Front. After the German surrender in Stalingrad, the losses in battle were beginning to pile up, even though Hitler remained adamant that Germany would be victorious. His Desert Fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had lost the Second Battle of El Alamein in North Africa late in 1942, which freed up the Allies to invade Sicily just a matter of months after the surrender of Stalingrad, before moving on to mainland Italy. Although the writing was already on the wall in terms of Hitler's demise in so many respects, just as he continued to believe himself invincible, the Allies were still far from confident of victory. Despite an upturn in their fortunes as 1944 began, the carefully planned invasion of France by the British, American and Russian leaders would be key to the outcome of the war. When D-Day came in early June, even Eisenhower, the American charged with overall command of the Allied operation, prepared 2 speeches to cover either the success or failure of the mission. The D-Day landings began 24 hours later than planned, due to unseasonable weather on the 6th of June, when the largest seaborne invasion in history left the south coast of Britain as 155,000 troops crossed the Channel. The element of surprise was absolutely crucial, and the Germans failed to take heed of their own intelligence reports. Firstly, they believed the attack would come from Dover, targeting Calais. Secondly, the bad weather convinced them that the Allies would wait for calmer seas. Even Rommel, who was in charge of defending the German position in France, went home to celebrate his wife's birthday, so sure were they that the invasion was some time off. However, when the onslaught of Allied troops arrived on the beaches of Normandy, a German defeat was inevitable, as Hitler's depleted armies were now pushed back on 3 fronts. The Russians were giving it their all in the east, the Allies were making great progress, working their way up through Italy, and now, with the beaches between Caen and Cherbourg swamped, a carefully planned pincer movement could begin. Although the Germans continued to fight back fiercely, the Allies were fast closing in, and Hitler, running operations from Berlin, was urged by his closest aides to flee the city. But as he stubbornly refused to accept their advice, his top officials knew that the war was over. It was simply going to be a question of when. But Adolf Hitler, facing a downward spiral, continued with more conviction than ever, and failure was simply not an option, as schoolboys of 15 and 16 years of age were rounded up in Germany and sent as reinforcements to the fronts, where the carnage carried on destroying lives for no purpose whatsoever. By the end of January 1945, the Soviets were only 100 miles outside of Berlin, and to the west, the Anglo-Americans were on German soil. Hitler had lost almost every territory that he'd gained during his campaign, and all he could do was throw everything he had left into the defence of Berlin. For those who'd followed Hitler with unquestioning loyalty, the fact that he stubbornly entrenched himself in his Berlin bunker by the time April came must have been both alarming and frustrating. A rational man would no doubt have been looking to escape to fight another day, but not Hitler. Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, took matters into his own hands and attempted to agree a surrender with the Allies directly. Hermann Göring, Hitler's officially agreed successor, suggested he take charge, as the Führer was in no position to run things from the bunker. Hitler's response was to sack both men, expel them from the Nazi Party, and brand them traitors. Interestingly, Hitler's companion in the bunker was Eva Braun, a woman who's been the source of much fascination to those trying to make sense of the man behind the legend that was Adolf Hitler. Eva had been involved with Hitler since 1929, and from 1936 onwards she'd been part of his household at the Berghof, his country retreat near Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps. They'd never married because Hitler was afraid of alienating his female admirers. But when Eva, like the Führer, was encouraged to flee to safety, she chose to stay with Hitler, claiming she was one of the few people left who'd stayed loyal to him. As the Russians got ever closer, on the 29th of April, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun were married in the bunker. But the 1,000-year Reich that had been Hitler's dream lay in tatters after a mere 12 years. And the day after the wedding, the bride and groom committed suicide rather than face capture. Shockingly, even at the end, Hitler showed no remorse, claiming his defeat had been due to the treachery of the officer classes in the German army. And even more bizarrely, he actually blamed the start of the war on the Jews and those who worked for them. Nevertheless, with the gunshot ringing out that killed Adolf Hitler, the war in Europe was effectively over. By the time the Russians arrived, bunker staff had partly cremated the bodies. But the most tragic find for them would have been the 6 beautiful, innocent children of Joseph and Magda Goebbels. Along with Hitler, Goebbels and his wife had killed themselves after taking the lives of their children in a suicide pact. As Europe celebrated VE Day on the 8th of May 1945, the war continued in the Pacific, predominantly between the Americans and the Japanese, until the newly appointed President of the USA, Harry S. Truman, gave the order to drop the atomic bomb, firstly on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki, forcing the final surrender, which marked the end of World War II. So we've also come to the end of our journey, charting the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler. Here, at the German cemetery at Le Combe, set back a short distance from France's Normandy beaches, made so famous during the D-Day landings of 1944. The salutary lessons of the true horrors of World War II and the carnage instigated by the obsessions of one man are clearly visible for all to see. It's all too easy to count the cost of Hitler's atrocities by considering how he treated those he made his enemies. However, the real tragedy is that his own people suffered horribly as well. In the 21st century, understanding how the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler came about will hopefully promote peace and a spirit of reconciliation, which this cemetery at Le Combe epitomizes. Over 20,000 German soldiers are commemorated here, many of them just schoolboys conscripted into the nightmare of Hitler's master plan for world domination. If ever proof was needed that absolute power corrupts absolutely, then the mass grave at the heart of this moving memorial is an eternal reminder to one and all to beware of anyone, soldier, statesman or politician, who offers the ultimate prize in exchange for democracy. There is also a price to pay, and in the case of Adolf Hitler, the cost truly was borne by the entire world.